What if I told you that 90% of your pain never actually came from other people? What if the real source of your suffering was something far more disturbing, something you created yourself, inside your own mind? That sentence is about to make sense in a way you're absolutely not prepared for. And by the time we reach the end of this journey together, you'll understand why most people spend their entire lives running from this one terrifying truth. There's a story that Carl Jung rarely shared openly with his students. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when a woman walked into his office. She wasn't crying hysterically. She wasn't shaking with visible trauma. She sat across from him with something far more haunting: the quiet, hollow devastation of someone whose entire inner world had just collapsed without any warning whatsoever. She kept repeating the same sentence over and over again, her voice completely drained of emotion. "I don't understand how they could do this to me. But here's what makes this moment so crucial for you to understand." She wasn't grieving a simple lie. She wasn't mourning a betrayal in the ordinary, everyday sense that we all recognize. She was mourning something infinitely more painful. She was mourning the complete dissolution of a person who had never truly existed in reality, only inside her own mind. Jung sat with her in that heavy silence and noticed something that would come to define much of his life's groundbreaking work. The agony she was experiencing wasn't arriving from what had actually happened in the external world. It was arriving from the absolute wreckage of a fantasy, a carefully constructed, deeply beloved, completely fictional version of a real human being that she had built entirely from her own longing, her own desperate hope, her own crushing need to believe that someone was exactly what she needed them to be. This, right here, is where most people's pain actually begins, not in betrayal, in projection. Because the human mind does something quietly dangerous the moment it encounters someone it admires, desires, fears, or loves. It doesn't wait for actual evidence. It doesn't pause to gather facts. It fills the silence with imagination. Think about it. You meet someone who carries themselves with natural confidence, and without even realizing it's happening, your mind immediately assumes they must be trustworthy. You encounter someone whose presence feels warm and familiar, and your mind starts scripting entire chapters of a relationship that exists only in your imagination. You meet someone who understands you deeply just once, one single moment, and suddenly your psyche begins constructing a complete human being around that single interaction. A human being who was never truly there to begin with. Jung's philosophy exists to bring you the kind of psychological truth that most people spend entire lifetimes avoiding. And this is one of the most important truths you'll ever encounter. Most people are not in relationships with other actual human beings. They are in relationships with projections of other people. They're in love with fantasies. They're defending illusions. They're hurting themselves with stories they wrote in their own minds. And reality, when it finally arrives, doesn't knock politely on your door. It enters like a blade. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, in the delayed reply that carries an entirely different energy than before, in the disrespect wrapped so carefully inside humor that you almost mistake it for affection, in the sudden emotional distance that appears precisely the moment you stop being useful to them. You've felt this before. Most people have. That slow, creeping realization that the version of someone living inside your mind, the one you speak to in your thoughts, the one you defended to others, the one you stayed for, feels warmer, more consistent, more real than the actual human being standing in front of you. Here's what happens when you finally wake up from the illusion. You start seeing something about people that will absolutely disturb you. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Once your perception shifts, you begin noticing something deeply unsettling about human behavior in general. People perform constantly differently depending on the audience, the context, the social reward available in that particular moment. The loyal friend you believed you knew becomes an entirely different person in a different room. The individual who insisted they valued honesty above everything becomes defensive, then hostile. the moment genuine honesty is directed at them. The person who expressed love with such apparent conviction withdraws that love the instant the emotional transaction stops benefiting them. And here's the part that disturbs most people when they first truly see it. The part that makes this so much harder to process. Most of these people are not consciously performing. They genuinely believe they are who they appear to be. They are completely convinced that the mask is the face. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow, the hidden, unacknowledged dimension of the human personality. Every element of ourselves we find unacceptable. Every impulse we refuse to consciously own. Every truth about our inner world we cannot bear to examine directly. Jung believed that the more aggressively a person avoids confronting their shadow, the more artificial and hollow their visible personality eventually becomes. This is why certain people begin to feel strangely empty the longer you know them. The performance develops cracks. The mask slips, not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation, but in brief, almost imperceptible flashes. 1 second of something genuine surfaces beneath the charm and disappears again. The insecurity living underneath the confidence, the envy concealed beneath the supportive words, the need for control carefully disguised as affection. People are not afraid of being seen. They are afraid of being seen completely. And perhaps this is why the moment you stop romanticizing people feels so profoundly disorienting, because it forces you to confront something you would rather not examine. How much of your own suffering was constructed by your own mind? How much of the pain you carried was created not by who people actually were, but by who you needed them to be? After that realization takes root, something fundamental begins shifting in the way you observe human behavior. You stop listening exclusively to words because words are the easiest thing to perform. You begin studying patterns, and patterns carry a different kind of information entirely. You notice how some people only become affectionate when they sense you withdrawing, how respect surfaces only after distance is established, how attention intensifies precisely the moment you stop pursuing it. You begin to understand something uncomfortable. Human behavior is at its core deeply reactive. Most people do not value what is consistently present. They value what feels uncertain, difficult to secure, potentially disappearing. This is why genuine kindness, freely given, unconditional, without the protection of clearly established limits, is so frequently taken for granted until it disappears entirely. Kindness without boundaries doesn't teach people to appreciate you. It quietly teaches them how to USE you. And the truly unsettling recognition is how early this conditioning begins forming. Think back to your early environments: school, family, the first social structures you ever navigated. The quietest individual in the room became the target, not because of anything they did, but simply because they demonstrated a willingness to absorb disrespect without consequence. The most confident person received admiration despite treating others with consistent carelessness. The one who sacrificed most reliably for everyone around them slowly became invisible, as though human beings unconsciously organized themselves around demonstrations of power long before they develop any sophisticated understanding of morality. What if every painful relationship in your life was teaching you the same lesson over and over, and you just couldn't see it? What if the pattern was there all along, and you were the only one who couldn't recognize it? This is what genuine awareness does to your relationships. You stop evaluating isolated incidents in isolation. You begin observing behavior as a cumulative pattern across time. And consistency has a way of making reality impossible to deny. The friend who reaches out exclusively during their own emotional crisis and vanishes during yours. The person who somehow transforms every conversation into a subtle competition. The relationship where vulnerability offered in trust later becomes weaponized against you. At first, these recognitions produce pain because the mind instinctively defends the people it has invested emotionally into. The rationalizations arrive immediately. They're overwhelmed right now. That wasn't what they meant. That's simply the way they are. But eventually, beneath the rationalizations, a quieter and more dangerous question begins forming. What if you have been translating disrespect into misunderstanding for years? Not because you genuinely believed it, but because the alternative required you to acknowledge a loss you weren't prepared to face? That question dismantles something fundamental because it reveals that many relationships survive not through love, but through denial. Denial performs remarkable maintenance work on connections that have long since lost their foundation. It keeps families functioning through patterns that would otherwise be impossible to sustain. It keeps toxic dynamics alive for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes. It keeps people emotionally attached, sometimes desperately so, to individuals who have already stopped genuinely valuing them. Most relationships don't end when respect dissolves. They end when awareness arrives. And awareness creates a particular kind of distance. Not always physical, but psychological. You begin feeling genuinely detached in conversations that once carried significant meaning. Certain compliments start landing differently, transactional rather than sincere. Certain gestures of affection begin registering as strategic. You stop being hypnotized by charm. And once that capacity for hypnosis disappears, the underlying mechanics of social interaction become impossible to ignore. You observe how groups unconsciously penalize authenticity, how people become visibly uncomfortable when someone refuses to perform their expected role, how genuine honesty destabilizes entire social structures built on carefully maintained collective fiction. Because most social systems are not fundamentally constructed on truth. They are constructed on mutual agreement, a shared, unspoken compact to avoid naming what everyone already perceives. The person who breaks that compact first becomes the problem. This is the strange consequence of seeing reality with genuine clarity. You become considerably more difficult to manipulate, but you also become more difficult to belong to groups, to communities, to the ordinary rhythms of social connection that most people navigate without much conscious examination. Because once you stop romanticizing people, you begin perceiving how extensively social life depends on performance. Status shifts human behavior in ways most people prefer not to acknowledge. The insecure become excessively agreeable around authority. The confident become dismissive around perceived weakness. Even moral positions shift according to available social reward. Someone publicly condemns betrayal while engaging in private betrayal with complete psychological ease. Someone constructs an elaborate image of honesty while carefully managing every perception of themselves for maximum control. And most disturbing of all, most people doing these things have no conscious awareness that they're doing them. What's the most dangerous type of person you'll ever meet? It's not the openly cruel one. It's someone far more subtle, far more deceptive, and they're probably closer to you than you think. Jung understood something genuinely brutal about the mechanics of human nature. The ego will protect its own image at nearly any cost. People require the belief that they are fundamentally good people. So rather than confronting the darkness within themselves directly, they construct sophisticated explanations that reframe it. Cruelty becomes honesty. Manipulation becomes caring. Control becomes protection. Jealousy becomes genuine concern. The human mind is extraordinarily skilled at concealing its true motivations, especially from itself. This is why some of the most psychologically dangerous people you will ever encounter are not the openly malicious ones. They are the individuals who are completely and sincerely convinced of their own innocence. The friend who consistently diminishes you while framing it as looking out for your best interests. The partner who manufactures guilt around your most basic needs for space and individuality. The person who generates ongoing emotional chaos and then positions themselves as the wounded party when you react to it. They drain your energy and your clarity while maintaining with total apparent sincerity the identity of victim. Victimhood itself can become a form of power. And the moment you understand that fully, your perception of human interaction changes in ways that cannot be reversed. Comment below. I trust my own perception more than I trust performed innocence. You stop focusing primarily on what people say. You begin asking a more revealing question with everything you observe. What emotional outcome does this person actually want from me? That question cuts through performance with a precision that words never can. Some want admiration. Some want obedience. Some want emotional dependence. A dynamic where your need for them anchors your behavior in their favor. Some simply want proximity to someone they perceive as beneath them, because that proximity temporarily quiets their own unacknowledged feelings of inadequacy. People rarely seek connection with the purity they claim. More often, they seek regulation, a way to manage the internal emptiness they cannot face in solitude. This is where the illusion of romantic love also begins to fracture, because many relationships are not fundamentally built on love. They are built on unconscious psychological agreements, transactional at their core, even when neither person has the self-awareness to recognize it. I will make you feel valuable if you make me feel wanted. I will be your stability if you never threaten my need for control. I will offer you admiration if you protect me from the specific loneliness I cannot tolerate alone. This is why people shift so dramatically when the emotional transaction changes. Not because they transformed overnight, because the mask was always attached to a condition, and conditions eventually surface. You can observe this most clearly in the moments that genuinely test human nature. Success, failure, transformation. Achieve something significant, and envy that was previously invisible begins surfacing in people you believed were in your corner. Become genuinely vulnerable, and hidden contempt emerges. Establish limits around your time and energy, and hidden entitlement appears with a force that can be genuinely shocking. Nothing exposes human nature with more efficiency than changing the role people had unconsciously assigned to you. The quiet person who develops confidence. The agreeable person who begins saying no. The wounded person who starts genuinely healing. Suddenly, the people who claim to love them become visibly uncomfortable. Not always loudly. Often in subtle withdrawal, in slight shifts of energy, in the specific kind of distance that communicates without saying anything directly. Because some relationships were built unconsciously, invisibly around your limitation, around your need, around your wound. People don't always love who you are becoming. Sometimes they love who you were when you were more manageable. And that realization, when it fully arrives, doesn't produce hatred. It removes fantasy. Once the fantasy dissolves, loneliness begins feeling qualitatively different. Not heavier, sharper, more honest. You begin understanding the significant difference between being surrounded by people and being genuinely understood by them. Some of the most profoundly isolated people alive have constantly active phones, full social calendars, conversations every single day. But no one in their life truly perceives them beyond their utility, their identity, or the expectation they were assigned. You may have felt this without knowing how to articulate it. That particular exhaustion after extended social interaction. Not physical tiredness, but something more like psychological depletion. The sensation of having been fully present in body while something essential remained hidden, protected, unshared. Hours of performing a version of yourself carefully calibrated to maintain everyone else's comfort, while the actual self remained somewhere unreachable beneath the performance. Jung understood this burden. He believed the heaviest thing a child carries is the unlived life of the parents. The accumulated weight of authentic selfhood that was suppressed in favor of what was socially acceptable, what was emotionally safe, what was rewarded. But this pattern doesn't remain in childhood. It follows people into every relationship, every social structure, every version of adulthood they construct. Society rewards the mask early and consistently. Be agreeable, be attractive, be successful, be useful, be emotionally digestible. Slowly, without any single decisive moment of choice, people stop asking themselves who they genuinely are. They begin asking a more socially practical question. What version of me receives the most acceptance? And once a person builds their identity around the answer to that question, authenticity begins to feel genuinely threatening. Not to them, to the people around them. Because a person who no longer needs external validation to feel stable is extraordinarily difficult to control. A person genuinely comfortable with solitude is nearly impossible to manipulate through fear of abandonment. A person who can perceive emotional games clearly